When my husband told me his son would be staying with us for a few weeks, I didn't feel anything in particular. Just a flicker of surprise, maybe, because he hadn't mentioned it before. No conversation, no consultation, just a fact. Presented at breakfast between buttering toast and reaching for the salt. That was how he handled most things. Quiet decisions, announced like traffic updates. Still, I nodded. I always nod. I met him, my husband's son, 3 days later at the front door. He was carrying only one duffel bag, dressed in dark jeans and a plain t-shirt. His posture relaxed but alert. He looked older than I remembered, older than the photos. His face had sharpened. Less boyish now, his gaze steadier. And when he smiled, not broadly, not warmly, just a half smile with one corner of his mouth lifting, something deep in my chest shifted, like a forgotten drawer cracking open. We hugged briefly. It was one of those awkward family greetings, short, polite, slightly stiff. He called me by name, not stepmom, thank God. His voice had weight to it, low, deliberate. I noticed the faint trace of cologne on his neck. Subtle, not sweet, clean. He settled into the guest room on the second floor. I helped him bring his things in, though he carried most himself, insisting he was fine. I stood in the doorway as he unpacked a few items onto the bed. I had the urge to tidy the space, to make it feel welcoming, but I stopped myself. It wasn't my role to mother him. It never had been. That evening, I found myself preparing dinner with unusual care. I chose a silk blouse I hadn't worn in months, the one that fit just right across my back, and added a touch of lipstick I usually reserved for dinners out. I told myself it was simple hospitality, a way of making him feel at home, but something about the way my fingers lingered on the fabric told a different story. At dinner, the conversation flowed easily. He spoke about the city he'd left behind, the job market, his frustration with temporary work. My husband listened, offered suggestions, but didn't probe. He never did. I asked questions, perhaps too many, noticing how often his eyes returned to me when he spoke. They weren't flirtatious, not yet, but they were observant, and I felt seen. After dinner, I brought out a bottle of wine. My husband declined. He had emails to catch up on. And retreated to his office, his son and I remained at the table. The wine softened the edges of our talk. He asked about my work, my routines, the way I spend my time. I answered honestly, maybe too honestly. At one point, he said, "You seem very precise." And it struck me in the gut, not as a compliment, but as a revelation. I watched him as he leaned back, glass in hand, the dim light from the dining room casting shadows across his jaw. There was something unfamiliar about the way he moved. Self-assured, but unhurried. Not a boy anymore. I felt my body react before my mind could catch up. A subtle stirring. A heat I hadn't expected. It made me uneasy. It made me alive. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside my husband, who was already breathing deeply. His body turned away from mine, his presence like a closed book. I stared at the ceiling, remembering the way his son had looked at me when I laughed. Not because I was funny, but because I had allowed myself to be light. The next morning, I stood longer than usual in front of my closet. My hand hovered over a stack of worn cotton tops before sliding across the hangers to a camisole I hadn't touched in over a year. Pale beige, silk, thin straps. It wasn't bold. That wasn't my style. But it said something quieter, more dangerous. I wore it under a fitted cardigan and jeans that still hugged in the right places. I told myself it was for me. That was a lie. Downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, making coffee. He turned when I walked in, his eyes flicking across my body for a fraction of a second before returning to the mug in his hand. That glance, measured, restrained, ignited something deep in my core. I crossed the room slowly, conscious of every step, every shift in fabric. We spoke about nothing. Milk, toast, the weather. But inside me, the drawer was open. The air around us had changed, and I knew I was dressing for someone again. Someone who wasn't my husband. Someone I had no right to want. The following days unfolded, in ordinary gestures, but I felt their weight differently. The clink of dishes, the rhythm of footsteps on the stairs, the quiet moments when I could feel him in the room without looking. My body had started to memorize his presence in a way I couldn't control, the way a person might learn the shift in temperature before rain, or the weight of silence just. Before thunder, we were rarely alone, but when we were, it was never truly still. Something always hung between us. An unfinished sentence, a shared breath, a glance just a second too long. He never touched me, not even accidentally. And maybe that was what burned the most. The restraint, the choice, the maddening knowledge that he was just as aware as I was, and choosing silence anyway. One afternoon, while my husband was out running errands, I was in the garage, sorting old boxes. It wasn't necessary. I simply needed something to do, something to occupy my hands. I was bent over a large container, shifting dusty holiday decorations, when I heard the door behind me creak. "I can take those," he said, stepping closer. I didn't turn around immediately. I didn't trust. My face, he walked past me, reached for a box higher up, and I moved to steady it from the bottom. Our fingers met, briefly, stupidly, over the edge of the cardboard, and we both froze. My breath caught in my throat. His fingers didn't flinch away. They lingered just long enough to be intentional, then slowly retracted. I looked up. He was watching me, quietly, his face unreadable, except for the intensity of his eyes. It wasn't a flirtatious look. It wasn't even daring. It was something far more dangerous. The recognition of a secret already shared. Neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, like velvet soaked in heat. He stepped back, placing the box on the shelf, and then turned toward me again. The moment should have passed. I should have turned away, returned to my task, mentioned the weather, made a joke, but I didn't. Instead, I walked past him toward the door, brushing against his arm as I passed. It was deliberate, barely a graze, but in that touch, the line shattered. He followed. Inside, I headed to the kitchen and reached for a glass of water. My hands trembled slightly as I filled it. I could feel him behind me, close, watching, waiting. I turned. There are moments when choices aren't made. They happen. They unfold from some hidden place, some locked-away hunger that refuses to be buried any longer. This was one of those moments. I stepped toward him. He didn't move. I lifted my eyes to his. He didn't look away, and then, without warning, my hand reached for his shirt, not to pull him in, but to anchor myself, to stop the spinning. His hands came up to my arms, resting there, firm and quiet, and then it happened. His mouth found mine, gently at first, not urgent, not rushed, just the press of something that had been waiting too long. There was no groan, no sweeping cinematic gesture, only breath, only warmth. Only the sharp, raw awareness of skin against skin. I felt my body lean into his, not because I wanted to, because I needed to. Every nerve ending in me had been waiting for this collision, this answer to a question I hadn't even admitted aloud. We broke apart almost immediately, but it was already too late. I stepped back, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I didn't speak, neither did he. The sound of the front door opening snapped us out of the moment like a whip. My husband was home. I walked to the sink, washed the glass. My hands moved like a machine. He disappeared upstairs, and I stood there alone, with the taste of something forbidden on my lips, and the terrifying certainty that I would want it again. I didn't sleep that night, or rather, I didn't sleep. The way one is supposed to, folded into the warmth of a shared bed. Letting the body surrender to routine, I lay stiffly, eyes open in the dark, my husband's breath steady beside me. His arm occasionally brushed against mine, and I would flinch, not because I was startled, but because the touch felt wrong, heavy, uninvited. He murmured something in his sleep, turned his back to me, and drifted off again. That, at least, was familiar. At dawn, I slid out of bed before the alarm. The sky was still the color of bruised paper, and the house hadn't yet shaken itself awake. I moved through the bathroom slowly, deliberately, brushing my hair, applying a subtle layer of makeup, choosing underwear I hadn't worn in over a year. Black lace, soft to the touch, almost too delicate. It felt like a silent rebellion. Not against my husband, against the silence inside me that had been growing for too long. Downstairs, he was already at the table, the sun. He looked up from his coffee as I entered, and for a brief second, neither of us said anything. I could see the restraint in his posture, the way he gripped the mug a little tighter than needed, the way his eyes dropped to the table just a moment too late. There was no casual smile today, no greeting, just tension so thick it felt like humidity clinging to my skin. I poured coffee, sat. Our chairs were too close, or maybe the air was too charged. I couldn't decide. I took a sip, felt it burn my tongue, and welcomed the pain. It grounded me. My husband entered a moment later, breaking the spell. His voice, cheerful and steady, bounced off the kitchen tiles. "I was thinking," he said, buttering his toast. "We should take that trip. To the coast next weekend. The three of us." A pause followed. The sun looked at me, briefly. Then down again, I forced a smile. That sounds nice. But my chest felt tight. The idea of spending a weekend under one roof, sharing meals, playing the happy trio, made my skin crawl, not because of guilt. I wasn't sure I even felt guilt anymore. But because it all felt like a lie I hadn't agreed to tell. Later that day, I heard the son talking on the phone upstairs. His voice was low, but the walls in this house were thin. I couldn't hear the words, only the tone. Frustrated, tense, almost cornered. I paused on the stairs, holding a basket of folded laundry, and listened. Then I caught a phrase, muted but sharp. "I can't. I told you. It's not that simple." I froze. Not because I needed to know who he was speaking to, but because I understood instantly that the complexity he spoke of was me. We had crossed a line together, and neither of us had said a word since. Yet here he was explaining it to someone else, and I had no one to explain it to. No vocabulary for what I was beginning to feel. After dinner, I found his t-shirt folded on the back of the couch, light gray, faintly smelling of soap and something warmer. Him. I picked it up without thinking. Held it. Pressed it to my face. My body reacted before my brain registered the betrayal of the gesture. I stood there for a long time, and then I did something I hadn't done in years. I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, sat alone on the back porch, and stared into the dark. The quiet was oppressive, not peaceful, and the stars above me, usually a comfort, looked like witnesses. Later, I would lie in bed next to my husband, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, trying to remember the last time I had desired him. I couldn't. And what was worse, I didn't even want to. He asked me if I wanted to go with him to the market on Saturday morning. Nothing special. Just a trip to pick up fresh produce, maybe some flowers for the kitchen table. My husband had left early that day for a meeting out of town, and I had the entire house, and now this errand, open before me. I hesitated for a second too long, then nodded. Sure. We barely spoke in the car. The silence didn't feel awkward, just waited. The kind of silence that begs to be broken, but not by anything light. So we didn't force it. Outside the market, the breeze was soft, scented faintly with basil and roasted coffee from one of the food trucks. I moved through the rows of stalls as if the world was still normal. Tomatoes, cheese, herbs, but everything I touched felt more vivid, sharper, tinged with something I couldn't name. He followed close behind, sometimes next to me, sometimes just far enough to make me want him nearer. I caught him watching me when I bent slightly to inspect a bundle of radishes. He looked away when our eyes met, but not quickly, not apologetically. There was a small bakery stand at the end of the row. I bought 2 croissants and handed him one. Our fingers touched again. Brief, but enough. I felt that electric current. Again, that hum in the space between us. And when we sat on the curb to eat, our knees brushed, neither of us moved away. He turned to me, finally, with a look I hadn't seen before. Open, almost vulnerable. His voice was quiet. "You always look so calm, are you?" I didn't answer right away. I tore a small piece from my croissant and placed it on my tongue like communion. "No," I said. He nodded, looking down at his hands. "Me neither." We didn't say more. On the drive home, I turned the radio on to fill the space, but it didn't help. The tension was no longer subtext. It was the text itself. It filled every pause, every flick of the turn signal, every time he shifted in his seat. Back at home, I went straight to the kitchen, busied. Myself unloading the bags, I could feel him watching me again. The space behind me warm, charged, but he didn't speak, and I didn't turn around. Later that evening, after my husband returned and the routines of dinner and small talk unfolded with clockwork precision, I poured myself a glass of wine and went to the living room. He was already there reading, or pretending to. I sat at the far end of the couch. Our legs didn't touch, but they could have. He closed the book after a while, resting it on his chest. Then, without looking at me, said, "You looked happy today." His voice was soft, almost an echo. I didn't reply. Because I hadn't been happy, I had been seen, and in that moment, I understood something about myself I hadn't admitted before. I wasn't starving for passion or drama. I was starving to feel real in my own skin. That night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I brushed my hair back and undid the top button of my blouse, just to look, just to see myself the way I imagined he did. The reflection didn't lie. And that terrified me more than anything. It wasn't guilt that kept me awake. It was anticipation. My husband left before sunrise. A one-night trip, just a meeting and a hotel stay. He kissed my forehead gently in the dark, whispered something about locking the back door, and slipped out like he always did. Quietly, efficiently, without mess. I stayed in bed longer than usual, the sheets still warm from his body, but my mind already elsewhere. The room felt different without him in it, lighter. Or maybe it was just me, untethered for the first time in weeks, yet painfully aware of what that freedom might mean. By mid-morning, I was moving slowly around the kitchen, barefoot, robe tied loosely. The fabric brushed against my thighs as I moved, the silk cool against warm skin. The sun appeared in the doorway, mug in hand, hair slightly tousled, eyes a little swollen from sleep. He didn't say good morning, neither. Did I? We were past that now. I offered him tea. He declined. We stood there, close but not touching. The silence not tense this time, but full. Swollen with something softer. I caught myself glancing at his collarbone where it peeked from the stretched neckline of his shirt. He caught me. Didn't look away. I need to get out of the house, I said, more to myself than to him. Too quiet. He looked up. We could drive. A pause. Then, where? Does it matter? We left 20 minutes later, no clear destination in mind. The air was warm, the sky covered in those soft white clouds that never threaten rain but refuse to let the sun through. We drove in silence at first, through winding suburban roads, then farther, out toward the hills where the houses thinned and the land opened. He played music. Low, something bluesy, with a voice like gravel and smoke. I watched the road, the way his hands moved on the wheel, the way his arm brushed my knee when he shifted. Gears, none of it accidental, all of it denied. We stopped at a roadside fruit stand and bought cherries and iced coffee. I dropped one in my mouth, let the juice linger, and noticed the way his eyes followed the movement. I offered him one without speaking. He took it. There was an old motel nearby, one of those single-story places with faded paint and plastic chairs outside each door. I joked that it looked like a crime scene from a 70s movie. He didn't laugh. Instead, he parked. "I just want to sit for a minute," he said. But I didn't believe him, and yet I followed. We didn't book a room. We didn't need to. We sat on the hood of the car, eating fruit, letting the silence work its way between us. Then I said something. I can't even remember what. And he turned to look at me fully, not smiling, not blinking, just looking like he finally saw everything. And then I leaned in, or maybe he did, but it didn't matter. There was no tension this time, no hesitation. The kiss was unhurried, deliberate, filled with everything we hadn't said since the first one. His hand moved to my neck, not possessive, but anchoring. My fingers found his chest, resting there, as if they belonged. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't hungry, it was inevitable. When we pulled apart, neither of us spoke. The air was different now. The sky, the heat, even the sounds of distant cars. All of it altered, all of it slower. He looked at me, eyes steady. "We should go back," I nodded. "We should." But we didn't move. Not for a long time. Back home that evening, my husband returned with flowers. He handed them to me casually, kissed my cheek, and asked how my day had been. I said it was quiet, peaceful. He smiled. "You look like you again." I thanked him, placed the flowers in a vase, then excused myself to the bathroom, closed the door, and pressed my hand to my chest, trying to find my heartbeat again because he was wrong. I didn't feel like myself. I felt like someone I hadn't met yet, and I wasn't sure. I wanted to go back. The days that followed were suspended in a strange stillness, not calm, but a fragile, vibrating silence beneath everything I did. The air felt different. My own body felt different. There was a sharpness to sensation now, a hyper-awareness. I couldn't turn off. Every noise in the house seemed louder. Every touch, even the casual brushing of my own arm while drying off after a shower, left echoes across my skin, and he had pulled back. It wasn't dramatic, not abrupt, but I felt it in the subtleties, the way he stopped lingering near the kitchen in the mornings, the way he left the room when I entered, or how our eyes no longer caught each other in shared spaces. He was retreating, and in that retreat, I felt the raw sting of something far worse than guilt, loss. I told myself this was for the best, that it meant nothing had gone too far yet, that the shape of our lives, the quiet evenings, the carefully arranged dinners, the house full of routines would be preserved. But each time I saw him walk past without looking at me, something inside me shrank. Something I hadn't known was still alive. My husband suggested a massage. It was a Saturday, and we had no plans. He brought it up casually, as if reading from a script on how to be an attentive spouse. I said yes. I always said yes. That was our rhythm. I lay down on the bed, face turned away. He warmed oil between his palms, as he had done many times before. His hands moved along my back, skilled, practiced, and yet I felt nothing. No spark, no tension, just pressure and skin. My body, once reactive to his touch, now lay beneath him like a stranger's. I kept my breathing steady, afraid that if I let it waver, he might feel what I was hiding. When he pressed his hand to my shoulder blade and leaned down to whisper, "You're tense lately." I nodded. "Work," I said, but we both knew it wasn't true. That night, I prepared dinner absent-mindedly. My movements were automatic. Slicing, boiling, stirring. While my mind drifted elsewhere, I burned the sauce. No one commented. After the dishes were cleared, I went upstairs alone and stood in front of the mirror, slowly unbuttoning my blouse. The skin beneath looked the same, but I didn't recognize the woman who stared back. Her eyes were sharper, her lips slightly parted, her spine no longer held. By habit, she looked expectant, like something inside her had awakened and now refused to sleep again. I opened the drawer where I kept the pieces I never wore, the matching sets, the delicate fabrics, the lace that had once made me feel something close to powerful. I chose one I had bought years ago on a whim and never dared to wear, midnight blue. Barely there, I slipped into it not for seduction, not for performance, but to remember what it felt like to be wanted, even if only by the mirror, even if only by myself. He returned late that night, the sun, quietly, without greeting, walking upstairs and closing his door. I listened to the sound of his footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, the click of the lock. I stared at my own door for a long time, wanting to open it, wanting to knock on his, wanting to speak a single word that would pull him back, but I didn't. Instead, I curled into the sheets, the lace pressing into my skin like a punishment, and closed my eyes. I slept lightly, dreaming of corridors, with no doors, of voices that whispered behind walls, of hands that almost touched. In the morning, he was gone again, and I missed him like a limb. The silence between us became its own kind of language. We no longer lingered in the same rooms. The casual presence we used to maintain, pretending nothing had changed, that the air wasn't thick with unspoken things, began to unravel. He left early most mornings, said he had things to do in the city, friends to see, calls to make. I didn't ask questions, but I noticed how his laundry began to smell less like home and more like someone else's place. He returned later each evening. Sometimes after dinner, sometimes after I'd already gone upstairs. Still, I waited for the sound of the door, for his steps on the stairs. I hated myself for it. One evening, while folding clothes in the laundry room, my husband walked in holding a black t-shirt. "This yours?" he asked, lifting it slightly. It wasn't. It was his son's. I looked at it too long before answering. "Maybe. Looks like. One of my old ones." He held my gaze for a beat longer than usual. There was no accusation in his eyes, only something quieter. Uncertainty, distance, a crack forming. That same night, he brought home a bottle of wine we used to drink when we were newly married. He poured 2 glasses, lit a candle at dinner. I watched him try, in his own way, clumsy but well-meaning, to reach out. His hand touched mine briefly when he passed the salt. His eyes lingered a bit longer than usual. He told me I looked beautiful in that dress, and I thanked him with a hollow smile. I wanted to feel something, anything, but all I could think about was the son's silence. Later, after he went to bed, I wandered the hallway aimlessly before stopping outside the guest room. The door was closed. A thin stripe of light cut through the crack at the bottom. I stood, there still listening for movement. Nothing. I raised my hand to knock, not knowing what I'd say, only that I needed to say something. But before my knuckles could meet the wood, I heard a voice from inside. Muffled, calm, a phone call. Leaned closer. "No, I'm not avoiding, I can't be around her right now. Her," he didn't say my name. But he didn't have to. I stepped back quietly, heart clenching with a sharp, aching shame. Not because I felt exposed, but because part of me wanted to be heard, wanted to be caught, wanted to make him choose something. I returned to my bedroom, lay beside my sleeping husband, and stared into the dark. My thoughts spun like storm clouds. Why was he pulling away? Was it guilt? Or fear? Or did he regret it all? The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter. A simple line, scrawled quickly. "I'm staying with a friend tonight. Don't wait up." No name, no warmth, no closure. I held the paper, in my hands longer than necessary, as if it might change if I stared hard enough. Later that afternoon, my husband entered the bathroom while I was brushing my hair. He paused, looking at the shelf. His eyes landed on a bottle of perfume. "One I hadn't worn in years, new?" he asked. I shook my head. "Just old, rediscovered." He nodded slowly, then added, "You smell different lately." That word, different, clung to me the rest of the day like smoke. At dinner, we barely spoke. The chairs felt farther apart than ever. I ate mechanically, barely tasting anything, and kept glancing at the door. But he didn't come home, and for the first time since it all began, I realized something far worse than guilt. I missed him, not as a fantasy, not as a body, but as the only person who had made me feel seen in years, and now he was gone. I didn't open the curtains the next morning. The light outside felt indifferent, like it had no intention of offering comfort. I moved through the house in slow, habitual gestures, the kettle, the mug, the quiet hum of the refrigerator door closing. But nothing I touched felt like mine anymore. The kitchen felt borrowed. The air itself felt borrowed. He didn't return that night either, or the next. No explanations, no messages, not even a call. It was absurd how quickly absence could carve itself into a routine. I caught myself listening for his key in the door at strange hours, glancing at my phone as though it owed me an update. But silence was all it gave me. Silence and time. Too much of it, to think. I began replaying everything. The first evening he arrived. The way he looked at me over the rim of a coffee mug. That night in the garage, the hotel parking lot, the cherry stain on his lower lip. What had I expected? That he would stay and keep pretending the world we created is stolen. Glances was sustainable? That he would want the complications that came with wanting me? No, I hadn't expected anything, but I had wanted, and that was the problem. By the third night, I no longer knew if I wanted him back for what had happened between us, or because his departure had left me with a reflection I didn't recognize. I had crossed a threshold. I couldn't crawl back into the role of the gracious wife who made balanced dinners and asked how meetings had gone. I couldn't pretend that what I felt was just boredom. It was longing. Real, sharp-edged longing. And now it had nowhere to go. My husband returned home earlier than usual that evening. He placed his briefcase down, loosened his tie, and stood in the hallway for a moment, watching me from behind as I set the table. I could feel the pause behind his silence, something unspoken pressing against the walls of the room. Then, finally, "We haven't talked lately," I nodded without turning around. "I know." He pulled out a chair and sat, his hands folded in front of him like a man about to make a proposal. "I've been thinking, maybe we should take some time away. Just us, 2 weeks, somewhere quiet, the coast, maybe." My hand froze over the plates. Not because the suggestion was unexpected, but because of how desperately misplaced it felt. We were long past salvaging. Whatever had faded between us, but he didn't know that, or maybe he did, and this was his way of closing the gap. "I'll think about it," I said finally, sitting across from him. My voice came out softer than intended. Almost kind. He nodded, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, that quick calculation, the suspicion trying to surface. He knew something had shifted. He just hadn't found the shape of it yet. After dinner, I went upstairs, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and cried. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasping, no sobs. Into the pillow. Just a steady stream of tears that fell without permission. My body mourning something it hadn't had the courage to name aloud. Then, around midnight, I heard it, the front door opening. Soft steps. I didn't move at first. I waited, breath held. Then I opened the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. His room was down the corridor, the door closed, the light off. Beneath I stood there, one hand resting against the wall, bare feet against the wood, heartbeat louder than it had any right to be. I walked toward it slowly, not knowing if I was seeking confrontation or comfort, not knowing if I would knock or simply walk away. But before I could choose, the door opened. He stood there, still dressed, eyes red-rimmed, tired. He looked at me like a man who had been rehearsing an apology he didn't know how to begin. "Shouldn't have left," he said. I didn't answer. I stepped forward, and in the quiet, without instruction, his arms went around me. There were no words. Just the weight of his body against mine, the warmth of his breath at my neck, the roughness of his fingertips grazing the small of my back. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a seduction. It was surrender. And this time, neither of us pulled away. The morning after didn't feel like a morning at all. More like a fragile continuation of a night that had never truly ended. I woke early, not because I had slept well. I hadn't. But because my body refused to rest in the presence of so many unsaid things. He was still asleep beside me on top of the blanket, arms folded across his chest like he hadn't allowed himself full comfort. As if even in his sleep he knew this wasn't a place he was supposed to belong. I didn't wake him. I watched the gray light slide across the carpet, filtered through the half-closed blinds, and tried to imagine what this scene would look like from the outside. A woman in a robe sitting at the edge of a bed that wasn't hers, next to a man who wasn't hers either. Eventually he stirred, sat up slowly. No kiss. No word. Just the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from the knowledge that the spell had broken with the first sign of daylight. He dressed in silence. I watched the way his shoulders tensed when he reached for his shirt, the way he looked at the door like it was a question he didn't want to answer. He spoke only once, at the threshold. "I need to figure things out." I nodded. That was all I could give him, and just like that, he left the room. I stayed there a while, staring at the indent his body had left in the mattress. Then I got up, showered, dressed, and moved through the motions of a day I wasn't ready to live. Downstairs, my husband was seated at the kitchen island, flipping through the news on his tablet, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. He looked up and smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "I booked the tickets," he said. "The coast, 2 weeks from now." He said it like a gift, a gesture of love, of trying. I opened the fridge, closed it again. "That's nice," I replied. He studied me for a beat too long, then returned to his screen. Later that afternoon, I passed by the guest room. The door was ajar. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. The bed was stripped, suitcase missing, surfaces bare. It looked like a room that had never been lived in, but on the windowsill, he'd left something. A single folded piece of paper, creased twice. No name, no envelope. I hesitated, then opened it. I wanted to want less, but I didn't. That was all. I sat on the edge of the empty bed, staring at the words until they no longer made sense. That evening, my husband poured wine again, lit another candle, asked about my day. I answered. We moved like ghosts through routines we used to believe were living. The things I used to find comforting, the familiar creak of the stairs, the clean scent of his shirt, the weight of his presence beside me, now felt hollow, echoes of something that had once meant home. Before bed, he came up behind me in the mirror, placed his hands lightly on my waist, rested his chin on my shoulder. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. "You're so distant lately," he whispered. I forced a smile. "I'm tired." And that too was true. He left the room. I sat at my vanity, staring at my own reflection, searching for the woman who had let all of this happen, but she wasn't there. Only someone quieter, someone sharper, someone changed. In the middle of the night, I rose without reason. I dressed slowly, choosing jeans and a soft sweater, and slipped on flats with no sound. I walked down the stairs and opened the front door. The street was silent, empty, cold. I stepped outside anyway, and stood there for a long time, staring out at the place where his car used to be, knowing full well he wouldn't return. But I didn't go back inside, not yet, because I needed to feel what it meant to stand alone in this. Quiet, truly alone, and still breathe, still choose, still live.